Peter Doshi is an assistant professor of pharmaceutical health services research in the School of Pharmacy, and he is an associate editor at the BMJ. And Peter, I believe, is best known for his work in Tamiflu, which was in trying to get some of that data openly available so that people could assess the claims that were being made about the efficacy of Tamiflu.
This is the title was given to me by Kay, and so I had to create a presentation to match the title. So this is actually an experiment, and if anybody's uncomfortable with that, that's the informed consent bit. Nominal, I know, but the door is over there. All right, so who wants my data and what are they going to do with it? Some disclosures, as I always have this slide in, and you'll have it printed. You can look at it later. So I want to explain in 15 minutes who wants your data, meaning particularly trial participants, why do they want it, and essentially that means what can you do with that data, and why protecting patients is the reason that both sides give for either sharing the data or not sharing the data. It's always for the patient's best interest. So trials, and I'll focus mostly on randomized controlled trials here, are valuable because of the data that they collect from participants. You know, randomization is cheap, and since if there aren't statisticians in the room, I shouldn't say it, but you know, flipping a coin is pretty cheap. It's 25 cents. But actually, you need to buy a statistician's time, and you know, so it's that much. But that's cheap in terms of a clinical trial. It's really the systematic collection and follow-up that is expensive. So it's your data that holds the value. And in our paradigm of evidence-based healthcare, there's more inputs to this, but essentially those RCTs are important because they become journal publications. This has been the paradigm we've been living in. And journal publications then disseminate into various things like systematic reviews or practice guidelines, could end up in a magazine on a doctor's waiting room, and that leads to influence on decisions. But we've come to realize, I think people like Kay and others have been talking about this for decades now, but it's come to a more public realization that we have a big problem in the very beginning of this chain of events, in that most trials aren't published, so there aren't about half of the trials aren't published, we think. So we don't have journal publications for those. And of the ones we do have publications for, we might be having a slightly more rosy picture of the truth than what actually occurred in the trial. And so sharing your data, or the raw data from trials, sort of becomes the key to unlocking this problem, both in removing the happy face and getting the reality and getting all of the research results out there, so we can make decisions based on all the evidence. So there's a number of reasons for sharing data, and I'm just going to focus on one scientific reason and one ethical reason. The scientific reason is that we can correct this either intentional or unintentional error in our published record. And an ethical reason is data sharing reflects on our covenant with the patient or the trial participant to contribute to generalizable knowledge, to knowledge and for the good of society. And so data, I think this actually fits both of your models, Nancy, in that in either model, whether you have traditional distinction or integrated, data should be contributing to something more generalizable. And the amazing thing is, while it has been seen as a criticism of industry, we need to get that data, some of the most, so I've actually, in this presentation, I've cut out all the industry critics and only included industry saying the same things as the critics. And you see, this is the slide from last year, and there was a number of industry groups, including the trade organizations, PhRMA and FBI, its counterpart in the EU. But now we have even more, Johnson & Johnson, Novartis, Boehringer Ingelheim, it goes on, all essentially saying that this data sharing is a great thing because it promotes medical and scientific advancement. And you see that the companies here are committing to sharing their the patient level data, sort of the raw data from their trials. Pfizer, I just picked one company. Any of the companies, you find almost an identical statement. The goal this data sharing is about improving patient care and helping advance medical science. So everybody's on board. And in fact, this data has already been being shared in a pretty robust way. Over 2 million pages of data in some sort have sort of flowed out, not steadily unfortunately, but flowed out of the European Medicines Agency, the centralized regulatory framework in the EU, sort of like our FDA. So 2 million pages have flown out, and who has, the question for my title is, the title of the talk is, who wants my data? Well, interestingly, since we have the actual data now from this 3-year-long freedom of information expansion in Europe, we know that industry has actually been the top requester of the data. Now, second is, you see media, legal, and academia. Those are your top 4 categories requesting data, but industry is the top requester. So everybody clearly sees the value in this data. Now, the arguments against data sharing. This slide I also had in my talk last year, but I added industry to the academics and academics to the industry because everybody is actually making the same arguments these days. So you have some standard arguments like it's too much work, we don't have money to actually prepare the data sets and get them ready for sharing. If I share my data, then how will I get credit for that, that data collection, which was a lot of hard work? But the ones I want to focus on for this talk in our conversation here is about patient privacy and confidentiality and re-identification of trial participants. So this is an article that appeared in The Lancet not too long ago by Ian Chalmers, who I think most of you know, and Patrick Valance, who is a president at GSK. And they co-authored this editorial talking about how individual participant level data from trials can be used responsibly. And they pointed out that the All Trials campaign, which I think many of you know, alltrials.net, calling for all trials to be registered and all results to be reported, said that the All Trials campaign is not calling, at least at this point, for the sharing of participant level data. And I believe it's because it's a lot more complex than sharing summary results. So they say that the campaign recognizes that risks to personal privacy must be taken seriously. And what they are proposing here is that you need a much more controlled framework to share this kind of data. So it's open data, but not really open data. And this is one thing that for me was helpful to learn about it. Maybe it's obvious for everybody, but it came as a little bit of an epiphany for me. But people talk about the data being anonymized, or is it not anonymized, or is it de-identified, or is it not de-identified? But actually, the question you should be asking is what is, and this is what the computer scientists who work on this topic talk about, is what is the risk of re-identification? It's a gradient. Is there a high risk? Is there a low risk? Right? If you handcuff the person and put in front of a computer, they can't do much for it, so there's probably a low risk of re-identification in that case, right? If I handcuff the analyst, even though he has a database that has everybody's name, right? So that's a silly example. But what actually happens in the real world is you might share the data with a legal agreement. You don't just put it out there on the web. But the legal agreement adds in a layer of protection against re-identification, because now these people are bound by that agreement. So we can take a picture, a fully identifiable picture, and we can blur it a little bit, and you can figure out perhaps who it is. You can get that kind of information, but we can't figure out what color or whether the tie is solid blue or dotted, right? You can blur it even more, and you get, maybe you know that it's a person now, but not who it is. And so that's what they're talking about with the risk of re-identification and the need to manage that process carefully. How much do we blur it? What are the conditions on access to data that are appropriate when we share those patient-level data sets? The other bit is that, remember I said the argument both for and against the data sharing is that it's all about the patients and what we owe it to the patients who participate in the trial. This is what pharma and FPA, who said those great things about data sharing, also say. Clinical data in some cases have been collected subject to contractual or consent provisions that prohibit transfer to third parties. Such restrictions may preclude granting access under these principles. And so, this is too small to read, but I have been collecting informed consent, model informed consent forms used in clinical trials with an aim to study these to see really what was explained to patients. But I wanted to pull out the bit about what happens to your data, because this is always in these forms. And what is extremely, I think, really profound and striking for me is that pharma and FBA, if you read it to the letter of what's written in these forms, they're right. There's actually almost the guarantee that nobody will see your data except the company, the sponsor of the trial, the investigators, and the regulator. So all that business about we need to share the data in order to better science and advance, the practice, that's not supported by these consent forms. Now, does that mean that patients were very happy about that inability to have their data advance science and to make sure that published analyses are correct? I doubt it. Because I haven't seen any consent forms that say, rest assured, we will sequester this data and nobody else will see it. Right? There isn't any of those out there. So in form after form, we see, do you have a pointer here? Maybe not. Is it moving for you? Yeah, you see that the people who will review your data are the FDA, representatives of the sponsor, the IRB. But we don't have anything about Cochrane or systematic reviews or third parties. Again, same thing. Study personnel, sponsor, FDA, IRB, the hospital. And that's it. So this is a problem, and it's a problem that hopefully we can fix going forward, and that the informed consent forms, at least that part of the practice, changes so that patients or trial participants are told about what exactly will happen with this and what that means in terms of data sequestration, because that's essentially what these forms are guaranteeing. And it just happens that FDA has put out a draft guidance on this topic of the model informed consent form. And probably no surprise here, there's nothing in that draft guidance that talks about dissemination of the data from the experiments to third parties for the verification, for the advancement of knowledge. And so I think that's where we need to put in our comments and make sure that that is part of informed consent forms. And so that's the docket number if anybody's interested in taking a look. Thank you.